Scientists at Monsanto, a chemical giant looking to dominate the agricultural future, were obsessively working on a way to hack the biological clock of the dairy cow. They managed to isolate the gene responsible for natural bovine growth hormone and clone it, creating a synthetic version known as recombinant bovine somatotropin, or RBST. The promise was intoxicating for an industry driven by volume. Inject this thick, oil-based sludge into a cow every 2 weeks, and her milk production would explode by nearly 15 to 20%. It was marketed under the brand name Posilac, a name that sounded clean, clinical, and efficient, masking the biological toll it would take on the animal. When a cow is injected with Posilac, her metabolism is hijacked. She is forced into a state of hyperproduction that her body cannot naturally sustain. Nutrients are stripped from her bones and tissues to feed the udder, turning the animal into little more than a biological machine running in overdrive. The FDA, under immense pressure to showcase American leadership in biotech, fast-tracked the approval of RBST in 1993, relying heavily on summaries provided by the manufacturer rather than independent long-term testing. At the time, the narrative was strictly controlled. RBST was identical to the natural hormone, and the milk was indistinguishable from traditional milk. Farmers across the United States, struggling with tight margins, were sold the idea that this syringe was their salvation, a way to get more product from fewer heads of cattle. But as the injections began, the reality in the barn shifted. Cows that should have been healthy began to break down, their bodies withering under the artificial demand. This was the American miracle, efficiency at any cost, but just across the northern border. A very different and much darker story was starting to unravel within the halls of government. In Ottawa, the application for RBST landed on the desks of Health Canada's veterinary drug evaluators, a team known for their rigorous adherence to safety protocols. Among them was Dr. Shiv Chopra, a microbiologist and drug safety evaluator, who would soon become one of the most famous whistleblowers in Canadian history. Chopra and his colleagues, Dr. Margaret Hayden and Dr. Gerard Lambert, were expected to rubber stamp the drug, following the lead of the FDA and the manufacturer's bet. As they opened the binders and began to scrutinize the raw data, they noticed inconsistencies that the American regulators had either missed or chosen to ignore. The pressure on these scientists was not subtle. They were called into meetings with upper management and told that the drug's approval was a priority for trade relations and industry growth. Files would mysteriously vanish from their desks, only to reappear later, and they were explicitly told to focus on the benefits rather than the risks. But the gaps analysis report they were compiling revealed a terrifying lack of long-term safety data, particularly concerning the effects of the hormone on the immune system of the rats used in preliminary trials. The scientists found that the manufacturer's own study and 90-day trial on rats showed that the animals absorbed the hormone and developed antibodies, a reaction that was supposed to be impossible. This finding destroyed the industry's primary defense, the claim that RBST was destroyed by digestion and therefore biologically inert in humans. If the rats were developing antibodies, it meant the protein was crossing the gut barrier and interacting with the immune system, a red flag that should have stopped the approval process dead in its tracks. Dr. Chopra refused to sign off on the approval, demanding more studies and long-term toxicology reports that simply did not exist. The corporate lobbying machine went into overdrive, threatening the scientists with insubordination and claiming they were obstructing scientific progress. The battle within Health Canada became a public spectacle, with Chopra and his team testifying before the Senate, exposing the culture of fear and corruption that had gripped the regulator. They revealed that they were being pressured to release veterinary drugs into the food chain without the evidence of safety required by the Food and Drugs Act. It was a moment of national reckoning. Were Canadian standards for sale, or was the health of the public and the animals paramount? In 1999, largely due to the unyielding resistance of these scientists and the undeniable data on animal cruelty, Health Canada officially rejected RBS. The decision was a bombshell, creating a regulatory firewall between the US and Canada that remains one of the most significant trade irritants to this day. While the ban was officially justified on the grounds of animal welfare, specifically the horrific side effects on the cows, the human health questions raised by Chopra's team were never fully answered. They had successfully blocked the drug from being manufactured or used in Canada, but the shadow of the gaping hole in the safety data lingered over the industry. The rejection highlighted a fundamental difference in philosophy. The US system assumed safety until harm was proven, while the Canadian-European system demanded proof of safety before approval. To understand why the animal welfare argument was strong enough to ban the drug, one must look at the condition known as mastitis. Mastitis is a painful, bacterial infection of the udder that causes inflammation, swelling, and the secretion of pus and blood into the milk. Cows treated with RBST are significantly more prone to mastitis because their udders are constantly engorged and their immune systems are depleted by the metabolic stress of overproduction. A cow with mastitis is a suffering animal, and to treat the infection, farmers must pump her full of antibiotics. This creates a vicious cycle. The hormone injection leads to infection. The infection leads to antibiotic use, and the antibiotic use risks creating resistant superbugs. But there is a more direct, grotesque consequence for the consumer: the somatic cell count. Somatic cells are essentially white blood cells, the body's defense against infection, and, in the context of dairy, they are a proxy for the amount of pus in the milk. Because RBST-treated herds have higher rates of infection, the regulatory limit for somatic cells in the United States is set shockingly high to accommodate this industrial reality. In the United States, the legal limit for somatic cells in milk is 750,000 cells per milliliter, a standard that many other nations consider filthy. In Canada, the limit is 400,000 cells per milliliter, and in the European Union, the standards are often even stricter, reflecting a lower tolerance for infected herds. When you drink a glass of American milk produced under these looser standards, you are statistically consuming a higher quantity of dead white blood cells and inflammatory debris. It is a biological fact that the industry tries to mask with pasteurization, which kills the bacteria but does not remove the cellular debris of the infection itself. The whiteness of the milk conceals the reality of its origin: a stressed infected animal pushed to the brink of collapse by a synthetic injection. Canadian regulators looked at the data on mastitis, the 25% increase in infection rates, and concluded that the suffering of the animal could not be justified by a marginal increase in milk yield. But for the American consumer, this information is rarely on the label. The milk is simply presented as Grade A, a term that hides the grim biological metrics behind it. The divergence in these standards means that a tanker of milk that is legal in Wisconsin could be deemed unfit for human consumption if it crossed the bridge into Ontario. Beyond the pus factor, there is the chemical composition of the milk itself. Specifically a hormone called IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1. RBST treatment increases the levels of IGF-1 in cow's milk, a potent hormone that is identical in structure to human IGF-1. IGF-1 is a powerful promoter of cell growth. In a growing child, it is essential. But in an adult, elevated levels have been linked to the growth of cancer cells. Studies have shown associations between high levels of circulating IGF-1 in humans and increased risks of breast, prostate, and colorectal cancers. The FDA's stance has always been that IGF-1 is digested in the stomach and poses no risk, a claim based on the assumption that it acts like any other protein. However, critics and independent scientists argue that the casein in milk acts as a protective capsule, shielding the IGF-1 from digestion and allowing it to enter the bloodstream. The gaping hole that Dr. Chopra identified, the antibody reaction in rats, suggested that these proteins were indeed surviving digestion and interacting with the body. If IGF-1 from hormone-treated milk is bioactive in humans, then we have been conducting a massive, uncontrolled epidemiological experiment on the population for 30 years. The Canadian ban, while legally anchored on animal health, was deeply informed by these unresolved human health anxieties. Health Canada's internal memos acknowledged that while they couldn't prove a definitive cancer link, they also couldn't prove safety, and that uncertainty was unacceptable. The precautionary principle was applied: when in doubt, do not expose the entire population to a potential carcinogen. In contrast, the U.S. system prioritized the economic benefit to the pharmaceutical and dairy industries, shifting the burden of proof onto the consumer to show harm. This regulatory split created a unique consumer landscape. In Canada, you could buy milk with the confidence that no RBST was used in its production, but the modern world is not sealed off. Trade agreements and globalization have begun to erode the protective walls that were built in the 1990s. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, became the battering ram that the American dairy lobby used to force its way back into the North. American negotiators were furious about Canada's Class 7 pricing system, which allowed Canadian farmers to sell milk ingredients cheaply, blocking U.S. imports. Under the threats of tariffs and trade wars, Canada capitulated, agreeing to eliminate Class 7 and drastically increase the amount of American dairy allowed into the country. This opened the floodgates. Today, more American dairy products are crossing the border than ever before, ending up in food processing, cheeses, and industrial ingredients. The crucial loophole is labeling. While Canada bans the use of RBST on its own cows, it does not require a label on imported products identifying them as RBST treated. This means that a Canadian consumer buying a frozen lasagna or a bottle of protein shake might be ingesting the very hormone their government banned 20 years ago. The Made in USA label on dairy is now a source of anxiety for informed Canadian shoppers who find themselves squinting at ingredient lists. It has created a two-tier food system: the domestic supply, which is still RBST-free and tightly regulated for somatic cells, and the imported supply, which follows the laxer U.S. rules. For the American viewer, the irony is bitter. You are stuck with the system that the rest of the world considers too dangerous to implement. Your milk is cheaper? Yes, but the cost is externalized onto the animal's health and potentially your own long-term risk profile. The rise of RBST-free labels in American supermarkets is a testament to the power of consumer awareness. proving that the market knows what the government refuses to admit. Walmart, Starbucks, and other giants have voluntarily moved away from RBST milk, not because the FDA required it, but because customers simply stopped trusting the product. Yet, the drug remains legal, and it is still used in herds that supply generic cheese, school lunches, and industrial dairy powders. The hormone scandal is not a historical event. It is an ongoing reality of the North American food supply chain. When you look at the somatic cell count difference, 750,000 versus 400,000, you are looking at a metric of corruption. It represents the difference between a system that serves the public health and a system that serves the quarterly earnings of biotech firms. Dr. Shiv Chopra and his colleagues lost their jobs eventually, fired for insubordination after years of harassment, but their legacy is the milk in the Canadian fridge. They proved that a few dedicated scientists could stand up to the most powerful corporations on Earth and win, at least for a while. But as the trade trucks roll north across the Ambassador Bridge, carrying tanks of milk produced with Posilac, that victory is being diluted. The questions they asked in 1998 are still relevant today. Why does the rat study show antibodies? Why is the cancer link dismissed without long-term study? Why is a cow with a festering udder infection considered a viable unit of production? The ban in Canada is a constant reminder of what the United States gave up in the name of efficiency. It forces us to ask, is the milk white because it is pure, or is it white because we have engineered it to hide the flaws? The purity of milk is a myth constructed by advertising. The reality is a bioindustrial fluid managed by risk algorithms. The scandal is not just that the hormone is used, it is that the consumer was never supposed to know the difference. We have accepted a food system where legal does not mean safe, and where banned is just a trade barrier to be negotiated away. The next time you reach for that carton, remember the 90-day rat study that was buried in a binder in Ottawa. Remember the cows burning out after 2 lactation cycles, their bodies spent by a drug that forced them to give more than they had. Remember the pus count that is legally permitted in your cereal bowl. The glass of milk is the final battlefield of a war between biology and profit. It is a liquid witness to the decisions made by bureaucrats who will never meet the families drinking their approval. Canada drew a line in the sand, and for years it held back the tide of artificial hormones. But in a world of free trade, no border is impermeable, and the banned milk is finding its way back to the table. The only defense left is your own knowledge, the ability to read the label and understand the history behind the ingredients. This is why the scandal matters. It exposes the fragility of the safety net we assume is there to catch us. It shows that science can be bought, that regulators can be bullied, and that the definition of safe is fluid. The story of American milk in Canada is a warning, a beacon flashing red across the border. It tells us that sometimes, the only reason a product is legal is because no one was brave enough to stop it. As we move forward into an era of synthetic food and gene-edited crops, the lessons of our BST are more critical than ever. We must demand transparency, we must support whistleblowers, and we must value the health of the organism over the efficiency of the machine. Because in the end, we are the ones drinking the results of the experiment. And the experiment is far from over. The legacy of the RBST controversy is visible in every aisle of the grocery store where non-GMO and hormone-free labels command a premium. These labels are the market's way of apologizing for the government's failure to protect the standard. They are a quiet admission that the critics were right, that the consumers wanted purity all along. But for those who cannot afford the premium, the standard American milk remains the only option. And that milk is produced by a system that pushes biology to the breaking point. The scandal is that this became normal, that we accepted the swollen udders and the antibiotic cocktails as the cost of doing business. Canada's ban stands as a monument to a different path, a path not taken by its southern neighbor. It serves as proof that it is possible to say no to technology when it crosses an ethical or biological line. But monuments crumble, and trade deals are the erosion that wears them down. The fight for the integrity of our food is a perpetual struggle, one that requires constant vigilance. So when you hear about trade disputes over dairy, know that it is not just about tariffs and quotas. It is about the somatic cell count, the IGF-1 levels, and the right to know what is entering your body. It is about the ghosts of the 1990s rising up to remind us that some shortcuts have a price we have not yet finished paying. The milk looks the same on both sides of the border, but the story inside the carton is worlds apart. One is a product of nature managed by farmers. The other is a product of biotech managed by shareholders. And as the lines blur, the choice becomes yours to make. Every time you open the fridge, do not let the industry silence the history of what happened. Share this knowledge. The ban in Canada is not an accident. It is a deliberate choice to prioritize caution over profit. And that is a choice that every consumer, American or Canadian, deserves to have. The hormone scandal is the story of the milk you drink, and it is a story that is still being written. Ultimately, the glass of milk is a mirror reflecting the values of the society that produced it. Does it reflect care, caution, and respect for life? Or does it reflect speed, volume, and the calculated risk of the unknown? The answer lies in the legislation, in the trade text, and in the whistleblower's testimony. It is a heavy burden for a simple breakfast drink to carry. But the weight is real, and it is measured in cells, in hormones, and in the integrity of the people who stood up for the truth. Drink with your eyes open. Know the source.